It gives me great pleasure to welcome Sir Patrick Vallance, a name known to everyone now, I am sure, who is the government's Chief Scientific Advisor. And it is very timely to welcome you, Sir Patrick, because of the major new announcement the Prime Minister made yesterday regarding setting up a National Science and Technology Council. This council will be tasked with assessing which emerging technologies the nation should back for strategic advantage. And so we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on this very important issue that we're discussing here today, and perhaps on where you see the country heading with its science and technology strategy. So Patrick, if I could have sort of 10 minutes on, or up to 10 minutes on your thoughts, and then we'll have a few questions for you, if that's okay. And I know that you need to be away pretty sharpish at 12:30, so we won't overrun. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Patrick Vallance.
Thanks very much. Great pleasure to be here and speak to this incredibly important topic. You know, this is the great challenge that humanity faces and is going to be longer lasting and more challenging in many ways than the pandemic. Science has clearly been very important in showing the link between human activity and warming, and remains important to try and elucidate how far that's going to go, how quickly it will go, tipping points and so on. But what I wanted to concentrate on in this session was, what do we do about it? And clearly the net zero ambition is an important one, and we have an awful lot to do. We have transport, heating, industry, concrete, steel, land use. All of these areas need attention if we're going to get to net zero, and we have 1,500 weeks to get to 2050. So that's the timescale to cover those areas and more in order to get down to net zero. And to do it means implementation of new technologies and existing technologies at scale. And to do that means we have to start now. A lot of these things need to be in place in the 2020s if we are going to get them at scale operational across the country for 2050. So 4 points just to kick off. One, anything that hasn't yet been discovered is unlikely to be help for us getting to net zero by 2050. We can't sit around waiting for the magic bullet that hasn't yet been found. Doesn't mean we shouldn't still look for it. Indeed, we should still look for it, and we should still look for new things. But the reality is that it's going to be not that, which is going to be the major way we get to net zero, including, for example, looking at things on climate repair and other areas. Point two, because of this, there's an urgent need to pull through and implement discoveries and innovations that we have now, and to iterate their improvement as we deploy them at scale. Point three is that the innovation that we put in place needs to be affordable. And that's obvious, but it needs to be affordable both in this country, but ultimately globally. And so inexpensive innovation is going to be a critical part of how we tackle this. And the fourth point is that there is a science behind adaptation as well. So we know that we've got climate change baked in already. And so we are going to see further increases in global temperature. And so we need to be able to adapt to that. And therefore the science of adaptation also needs to be taken into account as we think about what to do. I want to come back to this point of scale. To achieve what needs to be achieved, innovation needs to be applied at scale. What does that look like and feel like? Well, let's say roughly 20% of emissions come from heating in the home and in the workplace. If you just take the housing stock, at least 19 million homes need upgrades to get to a reasonable level of energy performance. If you think about heat pumps as a possible way to deal with the heating, there's an ambition to get to 600,000 per year by 2028. That is an enormous logistics, operational innovation challenge. And hydrogen, which could be part of the solution, again, has a scaling R&D challenge. How do you do that at scale and make it work? And how do you end up with the transition from gas boilers to hydrogen boilers in a way that's manageable? Huge R&D challenges. Transport, now the highest emitting sector by percentage. We're doing well in terms of electric vehicles coming online, but it's 400,000 today. And if you got to 23 million by 2032, that's 55% of all cars. So the scale of moving from, if you like, pilots and early stage to being able to do this at the scale that's required is a formidable R&D challenge, requiring late stage R&D, deployment, demonstrators, iteration around that. So we have to understand what the scale of the investment needs to be in that end of the R&D pipeline as well. And in order to service much of this, of course, the electricity supply is going to have to be huge, and that's going to require innovation there, including in things like interoperability and the ability to manage this across the grid with different sources of input. And then a sort of final scale and science point, which is we know that behavioral science is going to be important because a lot of us are going to have to change our behaviors in order to get into this new world of lower outputs of carbon emissions. This fundamentally comes back to this being a systems problem, and the Council for Science and Technology, which I co-chaired with Nancy Rothwell and now with Lord John Brown, wrote a letter to the Prime Minister about 18 months ago saying this needs a whole systems approach because there are synergies, trade-offs and interdependencies which are crucially important. You make one decision over here and it affects something over there. It requires, in order to do that, strong institutional leadership, both centrally and indeed locally, because much of this needs to be implemented locally. It needs a data and analytical capability in government in order to see what's happening, understand where the interdependencies are, understand what the effects of progress in one area or implementation in one area is on another one. And this total systems map is essential if we're going to get on top of this, because this cannot be done piecemeal. To some extent, it goes to the question I heard you asking Greg Clark at the end. This has to be an integrated approach. Hydrogen's a great example, actually, where you can argue endlessly not to do hydrogen in one area because it's not cost effective, but actually suddenly it becomes cost effective if you do it in 3 other areas as well. Those decisions need to be taken in an integrated way. And we need to maximize the technology input and uptake as part of this, as well as making sure we've got the finance mechanisms. These are full systems problems. The biggest unknown in the system is, of course, behavior. So let me just make an argument as to how we might think about this. We need to work back from 2050. We know what we need to have in place by 2050 and ask, what is it we don't know today that we would need to know in order to make the decision to go ahead, whether it's hydrogen, heat pumps, whatever it might be. That determines the R&D imperatives for the next couple of years. Get the answers to the questions. They won't be perfect. We won't have 100% answers, but get enough to be able to make the decision to go at scale and to continue to iterate. So that should be the R&D priority as well as the early discovery. We need demonstrators at scale. So we need living labs in order to test these. And we need continuous technology scanning, testing and pull through to keep pulling the new innovation in. The biggest unknown in any behavioral systems, in any integrated engineering systems approach to this is behavior. So we need to factor that into the systems map. Small changes in behavior can have big impacts on how you think about the systems map. So that, I think, is the requirement in order to drive this forward in a way that has a sensible innovation policy around it. And as we do that, we should also continue to look at some of the discovery elements which might come and help after this. So I'm not suggesting these are in any way going to help in 2050, but fusion needs to continue. It could be a help beyond 2050. Advances in materials research needs to continue as we think about replacements for concrete and other things as well. Those things need to happen. We cannot rely on them, but they need to be taking place now. So I think this is a whole system engineering problem. It needs to be tackled as such. It needs data analytics and real-time analysis of what's happening. People have argued you could also in some places use digital twins to try and make sure you get this right and model it as you go along. But I think that's the scale of the sort of operational side of the science and innovation challenge that we face as we try and bring this through into reality now. I will stop there, Stephen.
Sir Patrick, thank you very much indeed. We've got a couple of questions submitted in the Q&A. I suppose the first one is really around yesterday's announcement and the Prime Minister reiterating that he wants us to be a science superpower. Do you think we are well placed to seize the opportunities here in the UK to be a global leader in technology that is developed to meet our net zero ambitions? And perhaps that could set aside our recognised strength in genomics as well. How do we make sure that we are working collaboratively, but also leading and demonstrating that this can be done and bringing population along with us?
Yeah, so I think the point about the announcement yesterday and the way the Prime Minister framed it is that we know that the UK is extraordinarily good at research, and that's been the case for a long time, and we do very well in any measure of research success, and the universities are rightly broad and eclectic in the way they go after research. But there are some things which then need to come together as imperatives for government that need to be pulled together through into development, into innovation, into company startups, into economic growth as a result of that. And, two examples that we can look at recently, vaccines at the beginning of the pandemic, we looked around and saw that we didn't actually have the vaccine industry in terms of manufacturing and other parts that we needed in this country. That had not been a decision. It was, if you like, benign neglect. We were quite good at the science of it. We just hadn't pushed it all the way through. Another example might be 5G, where we had some science and engineering on it, but we hadn't actually got an industry developed around it, and as a result had to find it elsewhere. So these are things that I think government can make decisions on as to what it would like to pull through and use science and technology for. And there can be no better example than net zero, where we've got clear ambitions. We know what it is we need to do. And therefore incentives, everything from financial to regulatory enablement, right the way across the patch, to procurement from government, can actually act as both pull and push to create industries which we know are going to be needed across the world. So the answer to your question, I think, is a clear yes. I mean, this can be something that the UK can benefit from as well in terms of economic growth by making sure that we get the right businesses to help solve a problem which is a global problem. But it won't happen by chance.
No, I think we learn that from experience. We have to be quite focused on what we want to achieve. And actually following on from that, David Gillespie raises the point that if we're talking about being globally responsible, do we have a duty as an advanced economy to limit our growth in terms of overall consumption so that we can reduce emissions globally while increasing the quality of life of those less developed economies?
Well, I personally think that we do have a responsibility to make sure that we view this as a global problem and therefore think of global solutions. I mean, exactly as we've had to do in the pandemic. I mean, these are global problems that you need to deal with. I think the consumption point, it comes back to the sort of big behavioural unknowns. We can already see people changing certain behaviours, and we know that reducing the heat in our houses in the winter can make a big difference. We know that reducing certain types of travel can make a big difference, and so on. So there's definitely something around the consumption side that will be important in this. But I think there's also something around the innovation side. And one of the things that I think we've got to avoid is wealthy developed nations that have been instrumental in actually creating some of the problem then becoming focused on very high cost innovation, which can only be applied in their own countries, that becomes unaffordable and inaccessible to other countries. So what I term frugal innovation is going to be an important part of this, and those sorts of solutions which allow others to access it, I think, are going to be something that will be absolutely essential.
Thank you. A question here, I don't know who it's from, but it touches upon the role of geothermal in meeting some of the challenges. Apparently 40% of energy consumption in the UK is attributed to heat, which is obviously one of the areas that emits quite a lot of greenhouse gases. What do you think the role for geothermal in all of this is?
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as high as 40%, but it's certainly sort of 20% plus heating. But geothermal, I think, is obviously a solution in some places. So there are lots of solutions one can think of for heating. Geothermal is certainly one of them, and you can think in certain parts of the UK that's actually quite a neat solution. And I know it's one of the things that's being looked at in Cornwall, for example, and other places that have got that sort of a granite rock that allows that to happen. So I think there are solutions there. There are solutions also that relate to heat networks. So you can think of, for example, certain types of nuclear reactors. The advanced reactors actually create a lot of potential for heat distribution from the actual process, which could be used for heating, as well as thinking about heat pumps, hydrogen, electricity. So yes, I do think geothermal is one of the parts of the solution. And again, part of the challenge here is you can sort of see what the component parts are. Getting those activated, implemented, and put in at scale is the sort of stage of the R&D that we are at. And understanding, as I said, what are the things you don't know that you'd like to know in order to be able to do that? That's where the R&D dollar needs to be going now, so that we can actually get to those solutions as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Do we understand, do you think, what we need to know by 2050? Have we identified what the question is that we need to find the answer to?
To some extent. I mean, you know the buckets. So you know how much emissions coming from heating, industry, travel, concrete, steel, and so you know how much emission you've got from there, and therefore the sort of, yes, to some extent you know what needs to be done. Precisely how you can reduce that, of course, is where the challenge is, because we've just discussed 5 ways in which you can look at heating. And you could either choose to go all 5 of those in parallel and work up an at-scale plan for that, or you could make a bet on 2 or 3 of them. And I think those are the sorts of bits of information we need. How do you make that decision with your eyes wide open without waiting for an absolute definitive answer? Because you're not going to get the definitive answer. It's going to be a decision based on enough information. What stops you doing hydrogen? Well, it's things like production. Do you go for green or blue hydrogen? How do you get enough of it? Can you get enough hydrogen through the gas main without getting embrittlement of pipes in order to make that effective? Is that the right answer for everybody? These are things which you can get reasonable answers to as you think about scaling.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And I think, as you have to go presently, I'm going to wrap things up. I'm sorry again that we haven't managed to get all the questions asked that we had wanted to, but hopefully COP26 will prove a very useful fillip to getting some of these questions answered and to moving forward into the implementation period. So Sir Patrick, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning and for sharing your thoughts, and I think congratulations again on your new appointment.